The November fog rolled thick and heavy off the waters of Lake Washington, wrapping its cold fingers around the massive cedar trunks surrounding the property. Nestled perfectly into the shoreline sat a masterpiece of mid-century modern architecture, a house built of local timber, volcanic stone, and expansive glass walls that seamlessly blurred the line between nature and shelter. 72-year-old Kenneth Boyd stood by the kitchen island, quietly watching the fog erase the distant Seattle skyline. Kenneth was a retired chief architect, a man who spent his life analyzing structural integrity, calculating load bearings, and ensuring that every foundation he laid could withstand the test of time. He had built this lakeside sanctuary with his own two hands 40 years ago. Aside from the house, which was now valued at a staggering $800,000, Kenneth maintained a disciplined, comfortable savings cushion of $400,000 in a private treasury account. The quiet hum of the house was broken by the crunch of gravel outside. A sleek, late-model German SUV pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the gray mist. Kenneth sighed softly. It was Garrett, his 45-year-old eldest son. Within minutes, Garrett burst through the front door. He didn't carry the calm, grounded demeanor of a man visiting his aging father. Instead, he radiated a frantic, tightly coiled anxiety. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie slightly askew, and his eyes darted around the open-concept living room with a strange, predatory hunger. "Dad," Garrett said, forcing a warm smile that didn't quite reach his bloodshot eyes. "Look at you, standing by the cold glass. You really shouldn't be so close to the draft. Marge and I have been worried sick about you out here all alone." "The glass is triple-paned, Garrett. I designed it myself," Kenneth replied, his voice calm, steady, and measured. "I am perfectly warm. What brings you out here on a Monday evening?" Garrett walked over to the dining table, laying down a thick leather portfolio. He rubbed his hands together nervously. "Dad, we need to talk about the future. The winter is coming, and the storms by the lake are getting worse. You're 72. If power goes out, or if you slip on the boat dock, nobody is here to help you." Kenneth poured 2 cups of black coffee, placing one in front of his son. "I'm old, Garrett, not invalid. My health is fine." "For now," Garrett pressed, leaning forward, his voice dropping into a rehearsed, deeply concerned tone. "But Marge and I have been researching. There's a brand new, ultra-luxury senior living community in downtown Seattle called The Horizon. It's 5-star, Dad. Private chefs, 24-hour medical staff, indoor pools. We want to secure a lifetime suite for you." Kenneth took a slow sip of his coffee. "And how do you propose we fund a 5-star downtown suite, Garrett?" "It's simple," Garrett said quickly, opening the portfolio to reveal a pre-drafted real estate listing and a power of attorney form. "We sell this old house. A developer offered $800,000 in cash today. We use half of it to buy into the Horizon, and I'll put the remaining $400,000 into a high-yield management fund under my corporate account. That way I can handle all your bills and maintenance fees without you lifting a finger. It's the perfect blueprint for your retirement." Kenneth looked down at the documents. His architectural eye immediately noticed the rush job. The listing contract was missing standard municipal disclosure clauses, and the developer's name was a freshly registered LLC. More than that, Kenneth knew structural weakness when he saw it. Garrett's hands were trembling slightly, and there was a desperate edge to his pitch that smelled of absolute financial panic. "I need time to review the blueprints of this plan, Garrett," Kenneth said, keeping his voice entirely unreadable. "Leave the papers. I'll give you my answer on Wednesday morning." "Dad, the developer's cash offer expires Wednesday noon," Garrett urged, his voice cracking slightly. "We have to sign the intent to sell by tomorrow night." "I don't sign contracts without checking the foundation," Kenneth stated firmly. "Go home to your family, Garrett. We will talk on Wednesday." After Garrett reluctantly left, the house fell back into silence. Kenneth didn't look at the real estate papers. Instead, he walked out onto the covered back deck, stepping into the chilly night air. As he stood near the edge of the roofline, he heard the faint sound of a heated conversation from the driveway below. Garrett hadn't left yet. He was pacing beside his SUV, his phone pressed to his ear. Because of the architectural acoustic design of the overhanging deck, Garrett's voice carried perfectly up the stone wall. "I told you I'm handling it," Garrett hissed into the phone, his voice laced with terror. "The old man is biting. Once he signs the paperwork on Wednesday morning, the house goes to the developer and the cash hits my account. I'll wire the first $300,000 to your collections agency immediately. Just keep the bankruptcy court off my back. The luxury home? Please, I'm putting him in that cheap state-subsidized care facility near the industrial district. He'll never know the difference until the keys are turned over. Just give me until Wednesday noon. Up on the deck, Kenneth Boyd stood perfectly still in the dark. The cold wind ruffled his silver hair, but his eyes were as hard as reinforced concrete. The structure of his son's morality had completely collapsed. Kenneth walked back inside, closed the deck door, and picked up his private address book. It was time to call in a few favors from the State Department of Planning and Heritage. The Tuesday morning sun failed to pierce the heavy canopy of gray clouds lingering over Lake Washington, leaving the interior of the timber and stone house cast in a somber, muted light. Kenneth Boyd sat at his grand drafting table, the very desk where he had sketched the iconic skylines of modern Seattle decades ago. Today, however, there were no blueprints for skyscrapers or civic centers rolled out across the wood. Instead, the surface was covered with printouts of corporate filings, court dockets, and local business news articles. Kenneth's fingers, long and elegant despite the faint tremors of age, traced the line of a recent public notice from the King County Superior Court. The document listed Boyd Logistics, LLC, Garrett's commercial transportation firm, as the debtor in a massive asset liquidation proceeding. The structural integrity is completely gone, Kenneth murmured to the empty room. He didn't need to guess anymore. A single phone call to an old colleague at the State Department of Transportation had confirmed the worst. Garrett hadn't just suffered a minor financial setback due to market shifts. He had aggressively leveraged his entire fleet of transport trucks to invest in a highly speculative real estate syndicate that had collapsed spectacularly 6 months prior. He had lied to his investors, hidden the losses from his wife, and was now staring down the barrel of imminent corporate bankruptcy and potential criminal prosecution for fraud if he couldn't satisfy a $300,000 emergency margin call by Wednesday noon. Kenneth leaned back in his leather chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling beams he had personally calculated the load stress for 40 years ago. The pain of the betrayal was a cold, heavy ache in his chest. Garrett wasn't looking at his father as a parent to be protected in his twilight years. He was looking at him as a final, liquidable asset to be harvested and thrown into the fire to buy a few more months of superficial luxury. The acoustic perfection of the house had served Kenneth well the night before, revealing Garrett's plan to dump him into a cheap, state-subsidized warehouse for the elderly while pocketing the rest of the $800,000 home sale. But Kenneth wasn't a man who reacted with emotional outbursts. An architect does not yell at a failing wall. He reinforces the foundation and redirects the pressure. At 10 o'clock, the phone on the drafting table rang. The caller ID showed it was Marcus Sterling, an old friend from Kenneth's days on the State Heritage Commission and a senior partner at Seattle's most prestigious estate law firm. Kenneth, I reviewed the historical documents you emailed over last night, Marcus said, his voice coming through the speaker crisp and authoritative. The property lines, the original construction permits from 1986, and the architectural significance of the timber framing. It's a flawless application. If you choose to go through with this, it is completely legally binding and absolutely irreversible. That is exactly what I want, Marcus, Kenneth replied, his voice as steady as granite. I want the foundation laid before my son arrives tomorrow morning. Is the trust documentation ready? It is, Marcus confirmed. The Boyd Environmental and Architectural Heritage Trust has been officially registered with the state. As of 9 o'clock this morning, you have legally transferred the easement rights and the surface property deed to the Conservation Foundation. You retain a lifetime tenancy, meaning you have the absolute right to live in the house until the day you die, but the physical property itself is no longer an asset that can be bought, sold, mortgaged, or transferred by you or any heir for the next 99 years. Kenneth let out a slow, quiet breath. And the $400,000 in my private treasury account? We've restructured into an independent, locked educational annuity, Marcus explained. The funds are managed by our firm's fiduciary branch. They are completely insulated from any external legal claims, creditors, or family members. The payout schedule is fixed. It will cover the full university tuition for your grandchildren, direct to the institutions, starting when they turn 18. Not a single dollar can be touched by Garrett or his business entities. Thank you, Marcus. Please print 3 physical copies of the finalized covenants. I want them bound in the standard municipal blue jackets. I want it to look exactly like a land sale contract when it sits on my dining table. It will be delivered to your door by a courier this afternoon, Kenneth, Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. But Kenneth, you know how Garrett will react to this. When he realizes the house is locked away from him forever, the mask will drop completely. I know, Kenneth said quietly, his eyes drifting back to the window, where the fog was finally beginning to lift, revealing the cold, unyielding surface of the lake. I've spent my life studying how structures break under pressure, Marcus. I know exactly where the fractures will appear. For the rest of Tuesday, Kenneth went about his routine with meticulous deliberation. He chopped a fresh cord of cedar firewood for the hearth, stacked it neatly by the porch, and cleared the fallen leaves from the stone walkway. In the afternoon, a courier arrived, handing him a thick, sealed envelope containing the blue-bound legal documents. Kenneth placed the folder exactly in the center of the large mahogany dining table, resting a heavy brass architect's scale ruler on top of it to keep the pages down. Tomorrow morning, Garrett would arrive with his pen in hand, expecting to strip the foundation of his father's life to pay for his own architectural sins. But Kenneth had already rewritten the blueprint. The house by the lake was no longer a commodity to be traded. It was a fortress, and the gate was about to slam shut. Wednesday morning arrived with a brutal, biting clarity. The fog that had choked Lake Washington for days had finally broken, leaving the sky a vast expanse of pale, icy blue. The sunlight hit the glass walls of the house, casting sharp, geometric shadows across the mahogany dining table where the blue-bound legal folders lay waiting. At exactly 9 o'clock, the roar of Garrett's SUV shattered the morning quiet. The vehicle swerved aggressively into the gravel driveway, braking hard enough to throw loose stones against the cedar siding. A moment later, the heavy front door swung open, and Garrett marched in. He looked haggard, his face pale and drawn, with dark purple shadows bruised under his eyes. He hadn't slept. He carried his leather portfolio like a shield, his movements frantic and jittery. Time was bleeding away, and he knew the bank's noon deadline was less than 3 hours away. "Dad," Garrett said, his voice tight and breathless as he rushed toward the dining table. "Thank God you're up. The developer's agent is on standby at the escrow office in Bellevue. We need to sign these execution papers right now so the wire transfer can clear before the noon cutoff." Kenneth sat quietly at the head of the table, wearing a crisp denim shirt and a thick knit cardigan. He was holding a steaming mug of black coffee, his expression as unreadable as a blank blueprint. "Sit down, Garrett," Kenneth said softly, indicating the chair across from him. "Have some coffee. You look like a structure under heavy stress." "I don't have time for coffee, Dad," Garrett snapped, slamming his leather portfolio onto the table, right next to Kenneth's blue folders. He unzipped it with trembling fingers, pulling out the real estate sale agreement. The market is moving fast. If we don't lock this cash offer in now, the developer is going to walk away, and you'll be stuck out here in the winter with a house you can't maintain. Just sign the authorization page, and Marge and I will handle the rest. We can start moving your things to the horizon by Friday." Kenneth didn't look at the papers Garrett pushed toward him. Instead, he reached out and patted the bound legal document under his own brass ruler. "Before we discuss your documents, Garrett, we need to review the structural updates I made to the estate yesterday," Kenneth said, his voice dropping into the low, resonant tone he used when delivering bad news to a construction crew. A good architect always reviews the foundation before signing off on the superstructure. Garrett blinked, his impatience flaring into visible irritation. "What updates? Dad, the house is fine. We're selling it anyway. What did you do?" "I called Marcus Sterling," Kenneth said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I realize that this house is too structurally significant to be left vulnerable to the whims of the real estate market. So, as of yesterday morning, I officially established the Boyd Environmental and Architectural Heritage Trust." Garrett's hand froze midair. The nervous twitch in his jaw stopped completely. A trust. What are you talking about? Dad, we don't have time for legal games. We need to liquidate the asset." "Open the blue folder, Garrett," Kenneth commanded calmly. With a rising sense of dread, Garrett snatched the folder, flipping open the cover page. His eyes scanned the legal text, darting across the phrases stamped in bold black ink. Irrevocable conservation easement, 99-year non-transferable covenant, state heritage protection. "What is this?" Garrett's voice rose, cracking with a sudden, sharp panic. He turned the pages frantically, his eyes searching for the numbers, the financial payouts, the liquidity clauses. Where is the authorization to sell? Dad, where is the developer's clause? "There isn't one," Kenneth said, his blue eyes locking onto his son's face with absolute, unyielding intensity. "The deed of this property has been legally transferred to the Conservation Foundation. I retain a lifetime tenancy to live here. but the physical house can no longer be sold, mortgaged, or demolished by anyone for the next century. It has zero commercial market value today. It cannot be liquidated. Garrett dropped the paper as if it were a burning coal. He stared at his father, his breath catching in his throat, his face turning an ash-gray color. You locked the house. You gave away the deed to a foundation? I preserved the structure, Garrett, Kenneth corrected gently. I saved it from being destroyed by poor management. Are you insane? Garrett suddenly screamed, slamming both hands onto the mahogany table, knocking Kenneth's coffee mug sideways. The dark liquid pooled across the wood, but neither man looked at it. You old fool, do you have any idea what you've just done? I needed that money. I needed that $800,000 today. No, Kenneth said, his voice remaining flat, cold, and entirely steady. You needed $300,000 to pay off a margin call for a fraudulent real estate scheme, and you wanted to pocket the rest while throwing your father into a state-subsidized warehouse in the industrial district. The silence that followed the accusation was absolute. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked loudly, counting down the minutes to noon. The mask of the dutiful, worried son had completely shattered, leaving only the raw, desperate panic of a man whose last escape route had just been completely bricked over. The mahogany dining table was stained with the spreading dark pool of spilled coffee, but Garrett didn't even notice. He stood frozen, his chest heaving under his tailored suit, staring at the old man who sat perfectly still before him. The silence in the lakeside house was deafening, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. You heard me, Garrett stammered, his voice losing its aggressive pitch and dropping into a hollow, horrified whisper. On the deck. You were listening. The acoustic architecture of this house is flawless, Garrett, Kenneth said, his voice entirely devoid of anger, carrying only the weight of an absolute, chilling finality. I built the stone walls to reflect sound upward. I heard every word of your phone call to the collection agency. I heard how you planned to dump me into a cheap, state-subsidized warehouse for the elderly while you used the bones of my life to pay for your gambling in the real estate market. Dad, please, you don't understand. Garrett suddenly erupted, dropping back into his chair, his hands flying to his face as he let out a ragged, desperate sob. The arrogant businessman was gone. In his place sat a cornered wolf, clawing at any escape route. They are going to ruin me, Dad. Boyd Logistics is dead. The bank is freezing my commercial assets at noon today. If I don't wire that $300,000, the federal investigators will step in. I'll lose the SUV. I'll lose the house in Bellevue. Marge will leave me, and my kids. My kids won't even be able to afford their private school tuition. I'm looking at prison time, Dad. Kenneth watched his son weep. A deep, paternal sorrow twitched in his jaw, but his eyes remained as hard as reinforced concrete. He had spent his career studying structural failure. He knew that when a support beam was entirely rotted from within, adding more weight would only accelerate the total collapse. You did not come here to save your family, Garrett. You came to strip the foundation of mine, Kenneth said, leaning forward, his hands resting flat on the blue legal folders. You chose to leverage your trucks, you chose to lie to your investors, and you chose to treat your father as a liquidable transaction, and now the load-bearing limits of your lies have been reached. It's just a house, Kenneth, Garrett suddenly screamed, his grief turning back into ugly, venomous rage. He slammed his fist onto the table, splashing the spilled coffee onto the white pages of the trust document. It's wood and glass. You're 72 years old. You're gonna die in a few years anyway. Why do you care more about a piece of land than your own son's survival? You're a selfish, stubborn old bastard. You'd rather see me in an orange jumpsuit than leave your precious lake. If I handed you the $800,000, Garrett, you would throw it in the exact same fire that consumed your company, Kenneth replied, his voice dropping an octave, steady and quiet against his son's hysterics. By tomorrow, the money would be gone, and I would be sitting in a concrete room in the industrial district while you looked for the next asset to bleed dry. Garrett stood up, his face twisted in pure hatred. He snatched his leather portfolio off the table, shoving the chair back so hard it struck the volcanic stone wall behind it with a dull thud. Fine, keep your damn monument to yourself. Rot in it. When the winter storms come and the ice cuts your power lines, don't call me. When you slip on that dock and lay there freezing in the dark, remember that you chose this house over your blood. You're dead to me, old man. He spun on his heel, marching down the long timber hallway, his heavy leather boots echoing through the open concept space. Garrett, Kenneth called out. The command in his voice was so sharp, so inherently authoritative, that Garrett's feet stopped just 2 inches from the front door threshold. He didn't turn around, his back rigid with hatred. "Open the second blue folder on the table before you walk out," Kenneth said quietly, "because the house isn't the only thing I restructured yesterday." Garrett stayed perfectly still by the front door, his hand gripping the brass handle, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The silence of the house settled over his shoulders like a lead weights. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound was the wind howling across Lake Washington, rattling the glass panes. Slowly, driven by a desperate, lingering spark of greed and curiosity, Garrett let go of the doorknob. He turned around, his face a mask of bitter resentment, and marched back into the dining room. He didn't sit down. He stood over the table, his bloodshot eyes locking onto the second blue-bound legal folder that Kenneth had indicated. "What is this?" Garrett spat, his voice trembling with a volatile mix of exhaustion and fury. "Another legal trick to show me how much you hate your own son." "Open it and read, Garrett," Kenneth said, his voice remaining an absolute pillar of calm. "You spent 45 minutes lecturing me about the future. Now, read what the future actually looks like." Garrett snatched the folder, flipping open the heavy cardstock cover. His eyes scanned the title page, "The Boyd Family Educational Annuity and Restitution Trust." As his eyes moved down the dense legal text, his face underwent a terrifying transformation, shifting from rage to complete, hollow disbelief. "The $400,000, Garrett whispered, the paper rattling violently in his grip. "Your Treasury savings bonds. You liquidated them yesterday." "I did," Kenneth replied, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "Every single dollar of my personal cash reserves has been transferred into that locked annuity. It is managed independently by Marcus Sterling's fiduciary firm. The funds are entirely insulated from any bankruptcy court, corporate liquidation, or third-party debt collection agency." A sudden, manic light flashed in Garrett's eyes. He leaned closer, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading pitch. "Then it's safe? The court can't touch it? Dad, the money is insulated. You can wire the $300,000 from that trust directly to my creditors. You can tell the law firm it's an emergency loan. They'll listen to you." "Read the payout schedule, Garrett," Kenneth said, his eyes drilling into his son's face. "Read exactly who owns that money now." Garrett's eyes darted down the page, his lips moving silently as he read the ironclad clauses. "Funds are strictly designated for the direct tuition, academic housing, and institutional fees of the donor's grandchildren, specifically Leo Boyd and Claire Boyd. Payments shall be dispersed directly to accredited educational institutions upon enrollment. No liquid assets, principal, or interest shall be accessible, loanable, or transferable to Garrett Boyd or any corporate entity under his control." The document slipped from Garrett's fingers, fluttering onto the coffee-stained mahogany table. The final realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The house was gone. The savings were gone. His father had effectively stripped him of every single dime of his inheritance, bypassing him completely to lock the wealth away for the next generation. "You blocked me," Garrett whispered, his voice cracking, his face turning an ash-gray color. "You completely wrote me out. I'm drowning, Kenneth. I am staring at a federal prison sentence, and you choose to lock $400,000 away for kids who won't even go to college for another 5 years? "I didn't write you out, Garrett. I insulated my grandchildren from the wreckage you created," Kenneth said, his voice dropping into a chillingly firm parental tone. "If I gave you that money, you would spend it today to save your own skin, and by tomorrow, Leo and Claire would have a bankrupt father and a ruined future. I am ensuring that no matter how low you fall, your children will still carry the Boyd name with dignity and education." "I don't care about 5 years from now," Garrett roared, his desperation turning into an ugly, animalistic panic as he checked his watch. It was 11:15 a.m., 45 minutes until the bank deadline. "I need the cash now. Do you hear me? If you don't call Marcus Sterling right now and break this trust, I am going to the Bellevue house, I am packing my bags, and I am leaving this family forever. You will never see your grandchildren again. I will make sure they don't even know your name." Kenneth stood up. For the first time during the entire confrontation, the retired architect rose to his full height. Despite his age, his posture was straight, his shoulders broad, carrying the unyielding authority of a man who had built monuments out of stone. "You will not use my grandchildren as currency for your blackmail, Garrett," Kenneth said, his voice echoing off the timber walls with the force of a thunderclap. Because if you walk out that door without listening to my final blueprint, you won't just be dealing with the bankruptcy court. You will be dealing with the police. The grandfather clock in the hallway began its rhythmic chime, striking 11:30. The sound echoed through the high timber ceilings, counting down the final 30 minutes of Garrett's financial life. Garrett frozen, his hand shaking as he stared at his father. The sheer weight of Kenneth's towering presence seemed to compress the air in the room, trapping Garrett within the invisible walls of a cage he had built for himself. "What do you mean, the police?" Garrett whispered, his voice hollowed out by terror. "You wouldn't. I'm your son." Kenneth didn't blink. He reached down and opened a hidden side drawer of his drafting table, pulling out a third document. Unlike the blue-jacketed legal files, this was a plain white folder filled with printouts of digitized banking logs, corporate tax returns, and explicit screenshots of internal ledger alterations from Boyd Logistics, LLC. "I spent all of Tuesday working with an independent forensic auditor," Kenneth said, his voice returning to that flat, unyielding register. "You didn't just make a bad bet in the real estate market. You forged the signatures of your minority partners to leverage their assets as collateral. That isn't just a corporate bankruptcy matter. That is criminal fraud and grand larceny." Garrett collapsed back into his chair as if the support columns of his spine had been severed. He buried his face in his hands, dry heaving as the absolute reality of his situation pinned him down. He was entirely exposed. The old man had just reinforced his own walls. He had quietly mapped every single crack in Garrett's entire empire. "So that's it then," Garrett groaned into his palms, his voice muffled and defeated. "You're sending your own flesh and blood to prison. That's your grand architectural plan?" "No," Kenneth said, sliding the white folder back into the drawer and locking it with a small brass key. "An architect doesn't always demolish a damaged structure, Garrett. If the frame is still salvageable, he orders a total gut renovation. I am offering you a blueprint for a reconstruction, but the terms are non-negotiable." Garrett snapped his head up, a desperate, pathetic glint of hope flaring in his eyes. "What terms?" "Anything, Dad. Please." "First, you will sit at that table and sign a voluntary petition for Chapter 7 corporate bankruptcy. You will surrender Boyd Logistics, dissolve the shell companies, and allow the court to liquidate the commercial fleet to satisfy your partners and the legitimate creditors. You will not hide a single asset." "But I'll lose the company. I'll lose my title," Garrett protested. "Your company is already dead, Garrett. You're just trying to parade its corpse," Kenneth said coldly. "Second, you will legally sign over your power of personal financial attorney to Marcus Sterling's fiduciary firm. Every dollar you earn from this day forward will be monitored. You will sell the luxury SUV, move Marge and the children into a modest rented townhouse, and take a job as a salaried project manager for a construction company owned by one of my former apprentices. You will work 40 hours a week, under supervision, earning an honest living." Garrett stared at his father, horrified. "You want me to become a basic employee? To live in a rental? What about my reputation? What about my lifestyle?" "Your lifestyle was built on dry rot and theft," Kenneth stated firmly. "If you sign the bankruptcy agreement and the financial supervision covenant right now, the Vance law firm will issue an immediate emergency injunction to protect your personal residence from the noon liquidation, giving your family a safe transition. The trust will ensure Leo and Claire's education remains untouched, and I will keep this white folder locked in my desk forever." Kenneth looked down at his watch. It was 11:42 a.m. "If you do not sign by 11:50 a.m., I walk to the phone, dial the district attorney's office, and hand this file to the federal investigators. You will be arrested before the bank even finishes freezing your accounts." Kenneth placed a heavy, vintage steel fountain pen on top of the legal papers. The metal clinked against the wood, a cold, sharp sound that signaled the end of the debate. Garrett looked at the pen. He looked at the window, where the cold waters of Lake Washington remained completely undisturbed by the human tragedy unfolding beside them. He had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun the shadow of his father's legacy, trying to prove he could build something bigger, faster, and flashier. And now, he was forced to crawl back into the foundation his father had laid, begging for shelter. With a trembling, broken movement, Garrett reached out and grabbed the pen. He pulled the documents toward him. One by one, he signed his name across the execution line, surrendering his company, his financial freedom, and his pride. When the final page was flipped, Garrett let the pen roll out of his hand. He didn't say a word. He stood up, leaving his leather portfolio behind, and walked slowly down the timber hallway. The front door opened and closed with a soft, muted click. Outside, the engine of the SUV started up, lacking its usual aggressive roar, and drove slowly out of the gravel driveway. Kenneth Boyd sat alone in the quiet dining room. He reached out, picked up the steel pen, and capped it. He looked at the pool of spilled coffee on the table, pulling a linen napkin from his pocket to quietly wipe the dark liquid away until the wood was clean and polished once more. The structure had held, the legacy was secure. The old architect leaned back in his chair, watching